just press record because I always forget. But hello, and thank you all for joining us today for this workshop on US business expansion, legal and preparation. My name's Olivia, and I'm a program manager at Climate Salad, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I stand and work. For me, that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd encourage you all to pop the name of your traditional lands in the chat. I also support an Indigenous voice to Parliament. So today's workshop will be led by the wonderful Jack Chi, who is a director at William Buck, and also Anthony Curtin, a managing partner at Merton Lawyers. So thank you so much, Jack and Anthony, for coming in today and giving us some insights into the nitty-gritty of how to expand into the US. And I will pass it over to Jack.
Pleasure. Thanks, Olivia. Hey, everyone. Hi, Stefan. Long time. Hope you've been well. Okay, great. So we are talking about expansion to the US. A little bit of intro about what I do, and then I'll get Anthony to introduce himself. So I'm a chartered accountant. Our firm is called William Buck. Our team works exclusively with tech startups and scale-ups on all things financial. And obviously, one of the key questions that we sometimes get is, structuring, how to expand internationally, what's the right way to do it, what are the financial, accounting, and tax issues to be aware of, and obviously the commercial issues as well. So that is what I'm gonna talk about today. And Anthony, he's also extremely experienced in taking startups to overseas in the US in particular. I'll get Anthony to introduce himself very briefly.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. That's great, and thanks, Liv, for organising today and welcoming me into this ecosystem. And yeah, my name's Anthony Curtin. I'm one of the founders and the managing partner of Merton Lawyers. We focus on advising founders and investors in emerging growth companies. We have a real strong purpose around, being a catalyst of growth of the Australian innovation ecosystem. We advise through the whole life cycle, through all the complexities and all the challenges, but also the opportunities. And we do a lot of work helping, as Jack mentioned, helping a lot of Australian founders expand more successfully to the US through our Project Frontier program, which I'll expand on in our presentation. But looking forward to hearing from you, Jack, as always. And looking forward to connecting with you all at a later date.
Cool, great. Thanks, Anthony. All right, so let's get started. So I'll share the screen. I've prepared some slides, but feel free to put in questions in the chat. We will have a questions session, a time block for questions at the end, okay? But feel free to ask away in the meantime. And I'll bring up the slides, but we're just going to keep it a free-flowing conversation. Anthony's going to jump in any moment, and we'll go through some of the key topics, okay? So I'll share the screen. Everyone can see that? Okay, good. Good. All right, so usual disclaimer around this is not custom tailored tax advice. So the key topics I'm going to talk about on my side is, we're going to talk about very briefly about structuring fundamentals before we launch into international structuring. We'll talk about export market development grant, which is not as great as it used to be, and also some other considerations as well. Anthony, what are some of the key topics that you wanted to talk about on your side from a legal standpoint?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. A lot of the areas that we're going to be talking about are some practical considerations. So why you're launching, what to do to get ready, and then also considerations around a flip up, when you do it, what triggers it, what are some of the parts you can be doing now to get ready for that consideration, and how it impacts other areas like investment.
Great, awesome. And everyone, poor Anthony got given a couple of days notice about joining this webinar, so he didn't have as much chance to prepare. So, the slide, yeah, but I'm sure you could talk on the fly as well. So, all right, structuring fundamentals. So, look, the reason I want to talk about the fundamentals is that it's good to know, because it's in this context that we're talking about some of this US structuring. Okay, so what is good practice on the structuring standpoint? You're doing business through a company, which everyone is. I won't go through the benefits there. It's all very obvious. Holding shares in the company through a family trust for asset protection purposes and income splitting purposes later when the company breaks even. Okay, and the corporate group structure that I recommend to people a lot of the time is to have a holding company at the top. Separate the idea is separating the IP from the trading operations of the business, so that I'm not a lawyer, so I'm talking at a very general level, but if something goes wrong, then if there is a claim, God forbid, a claim on the business, then what's at risk is not the key IP of the business. Okay, so because the IP is held by either the holding company or a IP company that does not engage in risky trading activities. Okay, so normally a holding company and a trading company is quite common. Okay, but there's nothing wrong with just having a standalone company for the time being, because very few businesses are in a group structure from the moment that they start. I've seen it, but it's not very common. It's something you grow into. Okay, and then when you have a group structure, it's very important you form a tax consolidated group and possibly a GST group. The idea is that transactions between the group entities do not cause tax problems. Okay, so that's a quick overview on the structuring fundamentals. Now, some tips and traps. Okay, the number one is any sale or transfer of assets is for tax purposes is calculated at market value. Okay, so you may go, oh look, I'm just transferring shares or assets between one entity that's mine and another entity that's also mine. They're all related. There shouldn't be tax problems. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that unless you access some kind of a tax concession or rollover. So definitely speak to a tax advisor before you move valuable assets around. Another tip is the sooner you restructure into the correct structure, the better. Okay, why is that? Is because values tend to increase over time, and so do the size of the tax problem. Okay, think about tax concessions, like I mentioned before, and a major guide for how to structure something either domestically or internationally, which we'll get to very shortly, is I say to people, start with the end in mind, because ultimately you want to prepare for a long-term basis. So if an exit is what you're working towards, then ask yourself, what's the structure that best plans for this kind of an exit that makes it most attractive for the buyer of the asset, or is it IPOing? Okay, so that's a key guide on how to structure. So international expansion. So these are some of the reasons for expanding internationally. Okay, so you may be you want to access a specific testing facilities or locations. You may want to access a broader pool of overseas investors. And obviously, you may want to access overseas markets. You may want to attract and retain overseas staff. Or it may be that the actual exit is overseas. It's not in Australia. You want to list on NASDAQ, or you want to get bought out by a different company, different jurisdictions company. So an exit, a international expansion into those jurisdictions may make sense. Okay. when choosing the appropriate structure, when it comes to expanding to the US, the two most common ways people do it is you set up, number one, you can set up an overseas subsidiary, okay, i.e. you set up a foreign company, US, C Corp, LLC, and it's a subsidiary of the Australian company, okay? It's fully owned by the Australian parent company. Now, the alternative is overseas head company, where that you set up a new foreign company, and that foreign company is interposed between the current shareholders of the Australian company and the Australian company itself. Okay, so some people call it top hatting, some people call it flipping up, and some people call it interposing. But essentially, you're putting this new foreign company in between the Australian company and shareholders. Okay. I often get asked what is right for a particular startup or scale up, and I say a flip up is a hard egg to unscramble, and you definitely want to be sure that this is something that you definitely want to do. Okay, I've seen a company that flipped up to the US and then go, actually, you know what, we actually want to list on ASX, and then they flip back. And what you end up with is a bit of a mess from a structuring standpoint. Doesn't work for tax, not to mention it's expensive from an upkeep standpoint. Okay, so if you just want to access a new market and want to have some overseas staff to work on a business, maybe an overseas subsidiary is sufficient. Okay, because having set up an overseas subsidiary is far less committed than having to flip up to the US, and it gives you access to that jurisdiction doing a lot of things. Okay, so maybe something simple is sufficient, and I always advise people to go simple if you could. But if you want to access overseas capital or potential acquirers, sometimes you become more attractive if your headquarters overseas. Back in the old days, for example, US investors, they are more reluctant to invest in Australian companies, but these days a lot of people are pretty open-minded about investing directly into an Australian company. So this may or may not be actually applicable. Okay, Anthony, what are your some of your guiding principles? Ask this question.
I think it's a great summary, Jack. I think there's a number of reasons to flip up, and I think a lot of people really rush into it and feel that it's part of the course of expanding to the US, when really there's only a certain few reasons why you would flip up, and a lot of it, as you mentioned, would be based on it being investment criteria from an investor in the US. But and as you rightfully outlined, that it is also acceptable now for a lot of US companies to directly invest, and I can go into that further, but a lot of that relates to depending on the industry, whether it be clinical trials or whether it be R&D, which is very attractive to the US to maintain that. So I don't think it's a rite of passage that you immediately have to flip up. And I'll go into that further on, but I think everything you said, Jack's spot on.
Yeah, cool. All right. Whichever structure you go with, from a commercial, from a legal and tax and accounting standpoint, something that gets left out often by founders is intercompany agreements. Okay, so, and I completely understand why that is the case, because you go, okay, look, it's still the same business. Why should I bother going to the time and effort of having agreements between companies within the same business? Okay, the reason is from all those standpoints that I mentioned earlier, you have to treat the entities as separate entities, which they are, right? One is a company in Australia, one is a company in the US, subject to different laws, and they have their own tax man that wants to have their portion of the tax, if applicable. Okay. Australian entities, and same as US, they're required to deal with the overseas subsidiary or head company at what's known as at arm's length terms. So, i.e., what would you normally expect between unrelated parties? Okay, and typical intercompany agreements that are supposed to show these arm's length terms are, for example, loan and interest agreements for funding. Okay, licensing agreements for the use of IP. And service and management fees for the usage of employees, resources, and other assets. Okay, and this becomes very relevant when it comes to deciding who gets paid, which company gets paid by which company for what benefits. Okay, which then in turn affects things like income, taxable income, tax liabilities, and R&D tax incentive. Okay, so it's pretty much non-negotiable that you really have to sort these out. Yet it's amazing how often this gets left out simply because founders believe that, look, it's all part of the same business. I don't need to worry about it. And then they get into trouble, and it affects things like their R&D claim because it's not, they didn't structure their R&D operations correctly, or it's not clear who owns the IP. Okay. So lawyers need to prepare these agreements, and the tax person needs to cast their eye over it. Okay. So company agreements, big thing that people forget. Some tips and traps in determining the appropriate structure when it comes to US expansion. Okay, so once again, be sure it's the right long-term structure. Don't go there just simply because there is an accelerator there that requires the most common thing I get is, oh, we've been accepted into a US accelerator. Okay, this is really exciting, and as part of this, we need to do a flip up. Anthony, what are your?
No. It's in my presentation. I've got 3 case studies I go through.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I won't steal your thunder.
But it is. No, but you're right. Like it is, and I think people can get ahead of themselves. It is a great reflection to have that validation in the market in America, but you do have to think commercially around that long-term structure.
Yeah. So in other words, in my view, just simply being accepted into a US accelerator is not good enough a reason to flip up. Okay, there may be other things that change the course of your choices and decisions, but just that alone is not good enough. Okay. Another tips and trap. So you need to be clear on where the current and future IP sit, because it affects the R&D tax incentive. Okay, so I believe US has their own R&D tax incentive, and Australia has very specific requirements, because the Australian government is not going to pay you some kind of an incentive to encourage development of IP outside of Australia, to encourage non-Australian employment. That's just straight out not going to happen. Okay, so you need to bear that in mind. Another considerations, which Anthony may touch on later, is there an existing employee share option plan in place? Because if you do a flip up, then that gets affected. You need to almost flip up the option plan as well. Okay, and you need to do some tax planning so that the cross-border dealings do not cause you more tax issues than necessary. Now, a common comment I get is, yeah.
Sorry, I didn't.
Yeah, go ahead.
I didn't raise that in my presentation, but the one thing I think is such a good point around the ESOP. The other part is how that ESOP is structured, because when you flip up, you need to really be doing like for like in terms of structuring. But that ESOP, we're finding for a number of our clients, Australian clients, they're trying to have engagement on that plan in America, and the structuring of the Australian plans doesn't always fit from an appetite perspective, and they don't have that uplift in signing on. So there's tax considerations, there's legal considerations, but there's also a real key practical consideration around whether it's good enough for the market.
Yeah, and there's various tax issues associated with the flipping up ESOP as well, because you might need to access a rollover in order to not cause employees a particular problem, with their employee share schemes. Okay, and look, the last point I'll say on this slide is that yes, back to the tax planning thing, you might go, oh, but the business hasn't break even yet. Why do I need to worry about tax? Well, it goes back to the whole arm's length dealings thing again, because if, for example, you set up a subsidiary in the US and it's doing sales and marketing, okay, so that you can sell your SaaS platform, for example, okay, and ultimately the US RRS, their tax office will say, all right, you're doing business in the US, you're employing staff, you're providing a benefit to another entity outside of US. And this subsidiary, I expect it to make money and pay US tax. Now, if you do not have these agreements and intercompany cross-charging happening, the subsidiary ends up being in a position where it's just constantly racking up losses, and it's just a sitting duck for the US tax office to have a go at that. Okay, so that's why it's important to think about tax, even though the business as a whole hasn't quite break even yet. So I'll talk very briefly about Export Market Development Grant because it's a shadow of its former self. It used to be a decent grant where you can get up to 50% of your marketing expenses, including accommodation and travel, to market your product overseas. But the government has been really cutting back on the budget allocated to it, to the extent that where I'm like telling people, hey, we can help you prepare an export market development grant, but just be aware the amounts are nowhere near what it used to be, and it might not be worth your effort. Okay, so we won't go through the details today. Just know that the export market development grant is there should you spend a decent chunk of money on traveling overseas and in selling and marketing your product overseas. Okay, it's there. Some other considerations. This isn't really specifically related to the US expansion, but there's a really useful tool for you to use and search for grants. Okay, so there's the URL. We can share the slides afterwards, so you don't need to write furiously. Yeah, so this the grants in Australia, I'll say to people, it's industry specific, right? There's really literally hundreds of grants for industries, for different criteria, which region the business is based in. So there may be something that is relevant to your US expansion, depending on what specifically your business does. But Cleantech and Climate Tech is very much in favor, and there are a number of government, federal government, and maybe even state and local government incentives that can turn up if you use this search tool. Okay, so have a look. Other considerations. I won't go through a whole lot of detail. Just know that these are there. Okay, just know that these are there, and your accountant and financial advisors and lawyers need to be across those. Okay, so when there's dividends, interest, and royalties paid across borders, there's this thing called withholding tax. Okay, a portion of that needs to go straight to the jurisdiction of the country of the source of the payment. Okay, there's a bunch of sales tax considerations when you make sales overseas. US being a country with many states with their own rules. Make sure you cross what the requirements are by appointing a local tax advisor over there. Transfer pricing is the arm's length charges that I've spoke about previously. This is controlled foreign company laws, which says that if you have a subsidiary and that subsidiary is overseas, is earning income from sort of passive income, including royalties, then it triggers a tax issue in Australia, in the Australian company. Okay, it's designed to make sure that people don't shift these income overseas. Okay, and another consideration is there is what I would call a deficiency in the Australian rules, where if you just have a foreign company, so foreign subsidiary, but all the decisions are made in Australia, and that's where the board meetings are held and all that, then that foreign company, the ATO may decide that this is going to be a tax resident of Australia. Okay, yeah, sure, it's foreign registered, but ATO may say, hey, look, this company is an Australian tax resident, needs to lodge a tax return in Australia. Some of this income needs to be taxed in Australia, which is all very counterintuitive, but it's definitely something to be aware of whenever you have a foreign sub and that doesn't have its own arms and legs in terms of a board structure. Okay, so having the right advisors in both jurisdictions is crucial. All right, so they'll help you with the company setup and structuring, intercompany agreements, accessing government grants, and minimizing double taxation. Okay, and my contact details. Feel free to reach out. The QR code is just my LinkedIn. Okay, cool. So I'll stop sharing. Yeah, feel free to load questions into the chat box. And Anthony, get you to take it away. You're on mute.
That's a daily occurrence for me. So.
Yeah.
Can everyone see that? Yeah. Can everyone see that? My presentation? Yep. Cool. Awesome.
Yeah, we can see it. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Look, thank you, Jack. Thanks for that. And thanks again, Liv and Climate Salad. Awesome to be here. Yeah, my name's Anthony Curtin. I'm founder. That's a photo just before I had eye surgery. But yeah, we're Merton Lawyers. We've got offices founded in Melbourne, but we've got offices in Sydney and Queensland. Our services, we range from corporate litigation, property. We've got obviously black letter law, but we come with a commercial perspective. And we've got really good industry and government connections. And, we work with good people like Jack, who, know the space and nail in on our focus of advising founders and investors in emerging growth companies. And we really do believe in being a catalyst for the Australian innovation ecosystem. We don't want to sit on our hands pitching shareholders agreements to the ecosystem. We go out there and build products, and one of them we released in a beta form in February 2022 after a number of years of research. But really what it is, it was designed to do is assist founders and investors expand the US. We'll be looking at other services we're doing in the next few years, but really it came about through a lot of research and a product-led design focus where we interviewed over 100 stakeholders, particularly founders, investors, government, and created Frontier on the basis of their pain points, which were when they expanded. And these pain points just came up nearly 90% of the time, that they wanted to get good US legal advice. Had they done it again? They didn't understand the commercial nuances of expanding to the US, and they had a real lack of networks from investors, customers, and suppliers. So we had been doing a lot of work in Silicon Valley and with a number of firms there, but we tested a solution where we offered Australian startups the opportunity to be introduced to key US legal advisors that knew their space, that knew the key pain points, and narrowed it into Silicon Valley. And this is our MVP that we built. We've also got government support with New South Wales, Victoria, and Austrade. And we just tested the idea. And then we launched a more sophisticated version in July. But we've had some really great outcomes. And a lot of that came about through a number of companies that have been through it that you may know. And we've had over 80 companies through the program, and it's been great. It's shortened the time frame and lowered the cost to expand and create better networking opportunities for you guys. But what is the key questions for you when you're expanding to the US? And this is a lot of the reason why I raised Frontier is because a lot of the knowledge we've developed through Frontier has been some of the interviews that we've spoken to founders about and key clients, and obviously people like Jack as well. But really, the key question for you to understand, to ask is, why are you expanding to the US? Is it to launch in the US? Are you looking to raise money? Or are you providing equity to US employees, which is one of the key considerations that's coming up a lot. When they expand, they're trying to bring on the right talent. But what we were talking about before was that just making sure that it actually reflects what they should be getting and it's the right structure. Are you US ready? I mean, this is a key question. And I think it's imperative that you get good advice locally. What Jack mentioned before was so important around it being simple, but also thinking about that long term. And when you should actually set up that US company, well, there are some real key questions and considerations. That potential double tax issue, that scares me to death, and a number of our clients, when you can find yourself in that scenario reasonably easy. There's also that liability part of separating out your entities to ensure that you are minimising your liability as much as possible, so that in the event it doesn't work out, there might be a way to liquidate it and move on and do restructure some other way. The employment laws in Australia and US are also a key consideration. Are you employing key staff in the US? Or are you sending Australian staff over to the US? That is a key part to consider when you are setting up. It's also really important to understand the differences between contractor and employees, not only in Australia, but also in America. They have state-based rules on contractors and employees, and they can be very different, particularly from an intellectual property standpoint. The last one when there is a key client engagement. So one of our clients at the moment is negotiating with Whole Foods around sending their product over. That was a key trigger point for them to set up. But it's also meant that they haven't done that initial work to understand their structure and getting set up in place. So yes, they're setting up the US company, but in hindsight, they're not really that well set up. The which US state, I know this sounds probably very simple to everyone on this call, but it alarms me how much this comes up. We had a client the other day who's a very sophisticated, well-known client in the industry, expanding to the US, and they set up their entity there in Texas. And the reason around that was because they're big NBA followers, and they understand that a lot of the appeal of NBA players going to Texas was because some of the taxation laws there. Right from the outset, that was an incredibly foolish choice. And unfortunately, we got them into Frontier and got them set up a bit better. But when you are setting up, really at 99% of the time, it needs to be a really good reason. You set up in Delaware. The Delaware Corporation, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of an Australian parent company, is one of the solutions. But Delaware is the closest that the US has to a national corporations law and is the default option. From there, is that it? Blanket, no. Really, you need to be, when you are expanding to the US, you need to be really aware of back to that employment part. You need to register each employee in each state, so you really need to for where you're operating. So you really need a good legal counsel. Ideally, the one counsel that can advise on a number of areas, whether it be intellectual property, structuring, capital raise, but also that employee part, as well as a taxation. And also, are you looking to provide equity back to that ESOP? You need to look to the parent company and how that is actually being distributed. Has it been approved at the board level? And then, if so, how does it trickle down into the US employees? And is it something they're legitimately looking for? At the moment, we're restructuring the MedTech platform and their ESOP rules here in Australia as well as the US. And unfortunately, it's going to be a reasonably costly exercise. The one thing that they've lost is time. They've lost an enormous amount of time going over it. And now that time would have been better spent probably putting together a who's who of investors, building up their customer base in the US, but unfortunately they can't really do anything until this gets sorted. Data privacy as well is a huge piece. Although it's changing in the US, it's still state-based. So you really need to understand that each state has its own data privacy laws. There's a number of ways that they overcome this, but it's not like in Australia where we have a very fluid system where it's a national scheme and it's reasonably transparent. Over there, it's pretty cutthroat and can be heavily compliant. One of the questions we get quite a lot, and why we're getting, and one of the things that a lot of our feedback and research found from Frontier was the question of flip up. So, really a flip up is where the Australian parent flips up into a Delaware company. We find that really the only reason why you would flip up is investor driven. So the VC makes it conditional on the flip up. And I think it's really important to understand that, because a lot of clients that will go over there on a roadshow pitching to VCs will get through that, tick off maybe 7 out of 10 of their checklist, but they don't have an answer, or they're not going to have any consideration around flip up, or they might have a position that it's not going to do it at all. I think one of the things is to have an answer there, because really sometimes it's nothing to do with the team, it's nothing to do with the product, but as part of their investment criteria, it is an important part that they invest directly into an American company. And it really, for them, it provides some certainty and consistency in the investment, whether it be particularly around jurisdiction. What they don't want to be doing is, in the event there is a shareholder dispute or something that they need to potentially make a claim against a company, that they have to come to Australia. As we'll see, that has changed, but at the moment that is a key consideration. There are certain advantages to flipping up. If you have a VC or an investor making a conditional flip, in our opinion, you're in a good position. Generally, that's a key criteria, and it's just part of business in our opinion. Some of the considerations that, when you are, yes, there is a key investment that needs to be made around deal terms, but there's also huge benefits of strategic support of the VC. The amount is going to be significantly more. There's tax considerations that may be beneficial that Jack would probably highlight more. There's also opportunities of exit, the future listing, and then obviously the currency exchange. Disadvantage of flipping up, it is costly. It does take time. If you've got a really simple structure, it can be much more straightforward. There are some tax considerations that need to be met, and they can be quite significant if not met properly. It may also be the only option. We had a client recently that had to flip up on the basis of really survival of the business. Currency exchange can also bite in the other way, on the other way back, but it's also not for every industry. We raised briefly before around some, there are some fintech businesses or insurtech businesses that do have to flip up if they're going over to the US. They want to be registered there and take significant capital. There are some medtech and life science businesses that don't always need to be flipping up, and that's on the basis of protecting their R&D expenditure in Australia. It's also relating to talent, and also relating to some of the benefits of some of our clinical trials here that US investors see as being appealing. But I will go through just some of the case studies that we've seen. Jack raised before. We've had an early stage Australian media company get accepted into a US accelerator program. I think they saw the bright lights of being invited into a who's who. There was around $50,000 to $150,000 investment. The terms are actually okay, but they had to flip up. And in our perspective, it wasn't commercially the best best thing to do. One, they were probably bringing on a group of people onto the cap table that wasn't going to make them and investor friendly on the next raise. They're also going to probably eat up a lot of that investment flipping up, and they just it wasn't necessary to do it. So they actually didn't go forward with it. They've now received Australian investment. They've got a great venture capital group involved, and they're going to scale pretty quickly once they hit the US.
Sorry, Anthony, just to your point about the cost, I've seen tech companies using big law firms, and that cost would have eaten up exactly that 150K. So I've seen their accounts, so I know how much it costed.
And also, I've seen the other one is we've seen groups go not spend as much and try and flip up, and it's cost them more from a compliance perspective and from a time perspective. So unfortunately, you're going into a market where it is a costly exercise to expand to the US, but there's mammoth opportunities. We also had a second one. I mean, this is just a no-brainer. They had a great opportunity to expand. Tier 1 US VC, strategic partner, more than $40 million in investment, and they made it conditional that they had to flip up. It was a pretty straightforward answer, but it was a quick one. This one, Atlassian's one that I always refer back to, and I think it's kind of like a hybrid model of what happened, because they were founded in Australia, but they actually went to the UK before they listed on the stock exchange in the US. But I think their decision making was a real trigger point in Australia, and the US, in terms of how they perceived Australians companies to invest in. But they hired their first US employee in 2005 and remained an Australian company, but there wasn't an immediate flip up. And one of the reasons why was because they had to retain a lot of their talent in Australia. And I think that's one of the things that gets looked over a lot. And once the US company investors understood that, it was a real trigger point for them to remaining as Australian until they listed. One of the parts, I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley. I'm going back in September, and I spent about a month there recently. And a lot of our position was educating Australia on the companies that are coming over. Educating the US law firms and VCs on Australia, because what we found was there was actually a bit of a gap between their knowledge of Australia and the US. And once they actually understood a lot of the complexities that they thought were complexities were actually more bigger opportunities, there's more of an appetite there for them. But from our perspective, the groups that do really well in getting ready and is, back to Jack's point, is really getting early tax and legal, get advice around tax and legal issues in Australia and the US. Get DD ready as well. I know there was a separate presentation on this, but once if you're talking about flipping up, then generally you've got traction with the VC, your investor, and you need to have your financial, your accounting, legal, DD ready. because it moves pretty quickly, and if they're not seeing these things soon, particularly in this market, they'll move on. Build your pipeline. So, you know, I find, you know, building a US customer, advisor, and investor pipeline is just so crucial. We always advise founders to be doing that every day. Or sorry, not every day, but they should be doing it ongoing. It shouldn't be something that you wait till the end of the year. You should always be putting aside time to be, you know, building, having coffee, having time with an investor. You know, there's a great saying in Silicon Valley that if you want money, ask for advice, and if you want advice, ask for money. So you should really be building those relationships, playing the long game, and if they're not the right person to talk to, they will introduce you to someone too. It's a great way America operates, and something I'm really I've benefited from and very grateful for. Have an answer as to whether you need to flip up. One of the things that we always, that investors see that, and it actually pushes forward their investment, is when they have a knowledgeable founder or team that shows that, one, that they've actually considered a flip up, and two, that they actually have an answer to that flip up. And when that would happen, and who the people are they're going to be dealing with, that adds a lot of confidence to the investor that, one, you're considering all the right things for coming over here, and that you've got a good commercial head on your shoulders. And lastly, build your team. Your team doesn't stop with, you know, your number of devs, sales, and advanced manufacturing groups. It expands out to obviously lawyers, investors, advisors, and making sure that they're the right people involved and they've got the best interests of the company in their mind. I don't have a QR code like Jack and a really nice photo, but here are my details as well. I'll obviously circulate all that for you. But yeah, look, we're really proud of what we've done with Frontier, and we're always happy to have a discussion. If we're not the right people to talk to, we always make sure we connect you with the people that are. And yeah, look, well done to Climate Salad on what you guys have achieved, and for you guys to be here. It's great validation. Yeah, I wish you all the best. If there are any questions, yeah, Jack and I are obviously now available to talk through.
Thanks, Anthony. Our chat must be really good or really bad, because there's no questions in the chat box. But hey, you know, happy to take live questions.
Or I was on mute the entire time, which is good.
I thought it was a really good chat, but I don't have any questions. Right. It's all quite you know, kind of overwhelming stuff unless you've got a deal in the pipeline, I guess.
Yeah, look, it's not rocket science. It's just a lot of work, and if you're gonna go into that, then you just have to make sure that it's worth your while.
Yeah, that's right, and I think it's also just like,
well, Anthony, you're dropping out a little bit.
Wi-Fi, but I think Anthony breaking up a little bit.
Okay, cool. Any other questions while we're waiting for Anthony? Good. No questions at all.
I've got a question that doesn't necessarily have to be a specific answer for.
Yeah.
What's the general view for a merit for US companies if we just want to delay it and stay just operating, selling from Australia for a bit? Is there a point where you just don't get taken seriously unless you move over there?
No, not at all. You know, as you would have seen, right, in the media, you know, there's some of the most prestigious US VCs are willing to invest directly into an Australian company. So, you know, if I were a founder, I would, you know, only flip if there was something more than just a, you know, pie in the sky potential investment from a VC, because you can, Anthony can talk to this more, but you can very much have a flip up as a condition precedent to a big investment from a VC. A little bit garbled.
That's
Yeah.
okay.
It's better than before. Yeah, go for it.
But absolutely, like you, I think one of the things that if we're really communicating to the US is that Australia is going to be renewables, the climate powerhouse, and I think that's not what Steve's.
Yeah, we couldn't hear you properly, Anthony.
Pretty difficult to-
Sorry, mate. Yeah, the microphone's a bit bad. But feel free to reach out to Anthony in his email. But my view is that so it's you know, you can leave it till later. You can that's my view.
Sorry, is that good now?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit better. Give it a try.
Sorry. I'll just try and summarize.
No, still not good. Yeah. Luckily, we're towards the end of the session, but feel free to reach out to Anthony afterwards. Any other questions that I could help answer? Yeah, no problems, Anthony. Okay, good. All right. Look, I think I hope everyone got something out of it today. So good luck with the US trip, and I'll look forward to hear back from from Olivia and Stefan and Mick on how everyone went.
Well, thank you so much, Jack.
Thanks, Jack.
And this is such an important thing to get right when expanding to the US. So if anyone does have any questions, I know it's quite overwhelming to hear it in the 1 hour on a call. But Jack and Anthony are both more than happy to answer any questions. The double tax issue, something that I definitely would be exploring. Sounds painful. So thank you again, Jack and Anthony.
Yeah, great.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks all. Okay.
Thanks so much, Jack and Anthony.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.